Before the war in Ukraine started, the global outlook for cyber warfare was dire. Ukraine would be hit by power outages. U.S. enterprises would see the spillover effects of imprecise Russian cyber weapons like NotPetya, and needed to remain on alert in case sanctions prompted direct attacks on the U.S. Indirect attacks were supposed to be carried out by ransomware groups. And then, none of those things came to fruition. So what can we learn about the future of cyber war from the cyber war we already see in Ukraine?
The thing that I took away from, at least just that after the initial start, is that if you cling also to the idea of what cyber war is supposed to be, you're going to miss it when it happens.
Welcome to SC from the trade room floor. There was a point early on in the war when analysts backtracked on the grim positions they took before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me take you back to April 1st.
It's time for Tech24, and today we're looking at the state of cyber communications in Ukraine. For this, I'm joined by Peter O'Brien. Hello, Peter. The day after Russia invaded, you were talking about how the fourth battlefield would be cyberspace. Are you still standing by this?
It's a good question. I'd say that it is still an ongoing and a crucial part of this conflict, but I did perhaps overestimate Russia's ability to overwhelm Ukraine's communications using cyber weaponry, certainly in the first steps of this.
At that point, much of Russia's cyber warfare activities were out in the public. Several forms of wiper malware attacked different enterprises in Ukraine, ranging in sophistication from hackish to competent, and a DDoS campaign paired with a malicious text spam campaign attempted to create a run on banks. But the big spectacular attacks hadn't materialized. If you were waiting for the power grid to crash, self-driving cars to smash into pedestrians, or anything that Bruce Willis would chase down on a motorcycle, that didn't happen.
I think a lot of us expected things to happen a lot more quickly.
That's Tim Kasiba, a veteran of the DoD and FBI, and now the leader of Bracket F, Redacted's government division. Meanwhile, out of the public eye, two major attacks on infrastructure had been ongoing. Russia did attempt to tear down the power grid and failed, and the attack on Viasat satellite internet impacted both the Ukrainian military and other victims across Europe. Though Ukraine never lost power, Germany lost scores of wind generation facilities. But we wouldn't learn about either until much later in the process.
The way that the story came out also fundamentally offset how we understood it, because if the Viasat story had started off with, here it is, like this was a tactical attempt to disrupt communications, and it was intended potentially to break Ukraine's ability to communicate like between front lines and command posts, yeah, I think things would have started off on a different foot. But those details and that understanding of the incident didn't really start to fully materialize until the middle of March. And by that point, 7 or 8 wipers in, the conflict had already been rolling forward, and yeah.
That's Silas Cutler, principal reverse engineer for Stairwell. The first lesson we need to learn about cyber war from Ukraine, he said, is that when it happens, it doesn't necessarily look the way we'd expect. The race doesn't begin with a starting pistol. You don't necessarily find out right away. And the track may not be in full view of the bleachers.
The thing that I took away from, at least just that after the initial start, is that if you cling also to the idea of what cyber war is supposed to be, you're going to miss it when it happens.
Where Russia's cyber war efforts were most successful during the war, they were at their most tactical, not their most noticeable. Mike Benjamin, VP of Security Research for Fastly.
The nation states were active. We did see attacks, we did see infiltrations, but they still acted like nation states. They didn't, line up troops at a border with laptops. They were still stealthy. They still used their access they'd already achieved. They stuck to what they knew and what they were able to accomplish. And if you weren't prepared to defend against that before the war, you weren't when the war started.
The groups who were most desperate to be seen and heard turned out to be non-state hacktivist groups that rallied around Ukraine and Russia. The IT Army of the Ukraine, a global volunteer cyber militia, had a press agent.
Well, I think the first thing that became apparent is hacktivists, people being loud came out, like you said, DDoS attacks all over the place. It was actually entertaining. At a few points, we were able to see the exact same DDoS services being used by the Ukrainian and the Russian folks to attack each other.
The rebirth of hacktivist groups rallying around a flag has many of the experts I've spoken to worried. The IT Army of the Ukraine has the sympathy of much of the Western world, and many of their successes, briefly shutting down all shipments of alcohol in Russia, for example, have been met with Western glee. But there's no guarantee that the next group to follow that template will refrain from targeting any enterprise anywhere in the world for any perceived slave from any nation. Any cog in any system may be targeted in the exact same way.
Well, I think even just the point you brought up at the beginning around DDoS attacks, they become very concentrated in very small geographies and industries. And if that world were to become concentrated on your sector, in your geography, are you ready for it, right? That should be a concerning item for those that are not prepared for. I would say these attacks were not the largest we've ever seen, but even in the hundreds of gigabits, that can make a massive impact on most enterprises if they're not prepared.
Before the conflict, hacktivists were not expecting to be the prevailing non-state actor. There was an expectation that Russia would co-opt ransomware groups to do their bidding, providing Russia cover to needle the West. That never happened. Alan Liska, a ransomware expert with Recorded Future, explains why.
The biggest thing that disrupted that was the Conti leaks.
The Conti leaks were a series of internal communications leaked by an affiliate of the Conti ransomware group after Conti, with its many Ukrainian affiliates, announced it would target countries aiding Ukraine.
We know from the leaked chats that Conti had contacts within Russia, within the Russian government. We think specifically within the FSB. And they at least thought that they were, best buddies with the Russian government. They had said, yeah, we have a contingency plan. If we ever get arrested in Russia, we've got somebody who'll get us out. They had said that for a couple of their targets, although they didn't name names, that their other customer wanted to pay them for the data. So it does appear they had a close relationship. And we think, and this is what we thought even before the Russian leaks, they were the one ransomware group that had the closest ties to Russia.
If a group was going to aid Russia, it would have been Conti. But those widespread attacks never surfaced.
If there was a plan, it was sidelined by the fact that Conti really couldn't carry out operations, too much of their infrastructure had been exposed, etc. But also, and I think there still is an assumption, often, at least among some people, that Putin is this super wily, super smart, he's playing 3D chess while the rest of us are playing, checkers. I know that's a cliche. That was not the case with this invasion of Russia. By intel reporting way beyond me, he didn't tell the army what was going on. He didn't tell a lot of the people that needed to know what was going on. So any attempt to organize those kind of attacks may have been disrupted by the fact that Putin just didn't trust anybody and share enough information so that things could have been organized.
Russian disorganization is one of a handful of reasons experts speculate that Putin was unable to pull off the big-ticket attacks against Ukraine.
Operational failure. Nothing about this war on the Russian side has been coordinated. So neither of those, the operational planning has essentially been a disaster, whether you look at it from a military perspective, traditional, or from a cyber perspective.
That's Nilufar Razi Howe, who gave a talk of geopolitics of cybersecurity at RSA. She's the senior operating partner of Energy Impact Partners, a member of the board of Tenable, and the chair of the board of directors at Pondurance. Russia's inability to take Ukraine quickly, despite its military strength, stems from faulty logistics, corrupt and dishonest military leadership, and an overabundance of secrecy about objectives. But their cyber warfare operations have an additional wrinkle. Multiple agencies set up in competition with each other, often overlapping targets to impress Putin. It is disorganized by design. But the fact that Russia was unable to take Ukraine quickly provides another reason that cyber warfare never materialized, at least as people were expecting. Chad Sweet, co-founder of the Chertoff Group, and the former chief of staff at Department of Homeland Security.
I think, our thesis, and a lot of my partners at Chertoff Group I'm former intelligence, CIA, and Homeland Security and law enforcement, but our military experts who, know Russia, believe that because the original objective was to take all of Ukraine in 3 days, and they believed that, there was a view that they didn't want to use cyber to destroy infrastructure that they thought they were going to get their hands on very quickly, right?
There may be tactical and strategic reasons that cyber was not the first line of attack. Cutler again.
Cyber does become really unreliable in conflict situations.
Or, put another way, by Flashpoint's Anton Toth-Zifra.
But if you can take out a city's internet infrastructure by bombing their internet infrastructure by conducting a cyber attack.
Or, potentially, Russia's muted presence speaks to Ukraine's preparation for the conflict. As Danielle Jablansky, a non-resident fellow at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative of the Atlantic Council's Snowcroft Center, and an OT strategist at Nozomi Networks, explains.
When I reflect on what the beginning of the Ukraine conflict taught me was that arguably the Ukraine was the most well-prepared nation state in the world for any type of cyber conflict, right? So they've had aid, they've had lessons learned, they've been pouring resources into securing every part of their society because they knew that there was a credible threat at all times.
The same events that led many analysts to assume Russia would be big and loud may have inadvertently trained Ukraine to prepare for cyber conflict. Russia has historically very liberally hacked and disrupted Ukrainian infrastructure. They caused 2 blackouts, attempted to tamper with an election, and released NotPetya to first infect Ukrainian targets. Over time, Ukraine has learned to adapt, and now they've been given an international boost. The U.S. and many vendors have provided intelligence, and the U.S. has provided more hands-on assistance too. But it's clear Russia did make some effort to disrupt infrastructure, as Toth-Zifra explains.
At the beginning of this invasion, if you remember, Russia did attack, where Russian connected threat actors did attack satellite communication systems. So I would say that was a pretty disruptive attack. Now, why didn't they go? And also, there were since unveiled plans to attack the electricity distribution network a third time. We also know that a Cyclops Blink, a botnet connected to the Sandworm APT group, is dismantled early on in the February invasion.
For Americans, a muted Russian venture in Ukraine might seem like a reason to exhale a little bit. But the tactical nature of the attacks demonstrates an adversary willing to focus on high-impact pressure points in unexpected ways. Russia's early DDoS attacks and malspam attempted to force a run on the banks to create chaos. The Viasat hack pulled the rug out from military weaponry. Jablansky worries that an overwhelming public focus on flashy targets like power grids has trained people to underappreciate the tactical effect of targeting softer targets that still have a great impact on the economy.
I tell people in our field that we have done a huge disservice for the last 10 years using Stuxnet as a prime example, because there's cognitive dissonance immediately when you explain to somebody that the target there was a nuclear centrifuge, right? And to create high weapons grade fissile material. Anyone's brain who doesn't work in that world just kind of turns off and says, well, that's clearly not me, right? I operate a steel plant wherever I am in the world, and nobody would choose me as a target.
Despite warnings from CISA that sanctions might spur attacks on the U.S., heavier than expected sanctions did nothing of the sort. As Nilufar Razi Howe explained.
That comes back to escalation issues. So Russia doesn't want us in this conflict. They don't want to inadvertently pull us into this conflict.
But as long as the war continues, and particularly as long as Putin continues to feel pressure, some experts worry that we're still in the woods.
In cyber, I think we expected a response. I think what we're learning now is those likely response actions to the sanctions, for instance, are likely going to happen down the road.
There's a saying in the Russian military doctrine, I'm sure you've heard, escalate to de-escalate. And that means, if your back is against the wall, you just double down and fight harder so that you get your adversary to then be willing to compromise and back off. And so the more the Ukrainians succeed against the Russians, the higher the probability Putin may feel he has to take extraordinary measures to escalate in order to de-escalate.
That's Kosiba and Sweet. In the interim, the abundance of new cyber tools unloaded on Ukraine leaves researchers a rat's nest to untangle.
But kind of a lingering thought I've had on it for a while is, throughout the course of this conflict, the delivery and how fast analysis is needed to be, we'll find a sample at 11 p.m. one night, and by the next day people are trying to get out reports on it and put together as much information to help people scan and ensure that they're not impacted. But I think there's a lot that needs to be done, especially in the coming months, to try and untangle some of the mess that's been created in terms of our understanding of different actor groups and where these tools came from in some ways.
And Razi Howe says this is really only the warm-up for a main event that may happen down the line.
But at the end of the day, our American entanglement with Russia, from a business and economic perspective, is pretty mild. Our entanglement with China is at a different level. So the wake-up call here, which no one wants to talk about, is what happens if China invades Taiwan and we start imposing the same kind of sanctions that we're imposing on Russia. It's a completely different ballgame than what's going on in Russia.
This has been a production of SC Media. I'm Joe Uchel. The introductory song was What's the Angle by Shane Ivers. You can hear more of his work at silvermansound.com. Thanks for listening.